They thought it was just another routine flight, until a rude flight attendant humiliated an elderly couple in first class. But what she didn't know, she had just made the worst mistake of her career. Walter and Margaret Sinclair stepped onto the plane, their hands lightly clasped together. The air was filled with the hum of passengers settling in, the rustling of carry-on bags, and the occasional beep of boarding passes being scanned. It was supposed to be a smooth, comfortable flight, just another journey in their long, well-traveled lives. But within minutes, it became clear that something was wrong. Margaret glanced at her ticket, then at the row numbers above the seats, her brow furrowed. "Walter, we aren't seated together," she murmured, showing him her ticket. Walter's face remained calm, but she could see the flicker of irritation in his eyes. They had booked first-class seats side by side months in advance, ensuring that they could enjoy the flight together. It wasn't just a luxury, it was a necessity. Margaret, in her early 70s, had undergone surgery the previous year, and Walter always preferred to be close to her, just in case she needed him. Margaret turned toward a flight attendant, a tall woman with tightly pinned blonde hair and an air of strict professionalism. Her name tag read Missornishun. "Kakoni." Margaret smiled kindly, despite the frustration bubbling inside her. "Excuse me, dear," she said gently. "I believe there's been a mix-up. My husband and I were supposed to be seated together, but we seem to have been placed in separate rows." Ms. Jennings barely spared the ticket a glance before letting out a small, irritated sigh. "Seats are assigned ahead of time, ma'am," she said flatly. "If you wanted to sit together, you should have booked accordingly." Margaret blinked, momentarily taken aback by the coldness of her tone. Walter, standing beside her, squared his shoulders slightly. "We did book together," he said, his voice firm but even. "The airline must have reassigned our seats. If there's any way to correct this mistake, we'd appreciate it." Ms. Jennings rolled her eyes, barely hiding her impatience. "First class is full," she said curtly. "There's nothing I can do. If you want to switch seats, you'll have to find another passenger willing to trade." Walter inhaled slowly, adjusting his watch. He had seen this kind of dismissive attitude before, a quick judgment based on appearance. To Ms. Jennings, they were just another elderly couple, a minor inconvenience. People who didn't demand the same level of attention as the younger, wealthier-looking passengers. Margaret pressed her lips together, her patience running thin. "I understand that policies exist," she said evenly, "but this was an airline mistake, not ours. Surely there's something you can do." Ms. Jennings folded her arms, her expression set in stone. "Look, I don't make the rules. We don't do special accommodations. Just take your assigned seats." A few passengers glanced up from their phones and newspapers, subtly watching the interaction. Some turned away quickly, unwilling to get involved. Others exchanged quiet murmurs. Walter and Margaret exchanged a look. Margaret could see the shift in her husband's demeanor, not anger, but something far more powerful. Patience sharpened into quiet resolve. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Without another word, he typed a short message and hit send. Ms. Jennings didn't notice. She had already turned away, moving down the aisle with the kind of stiff confidence that came from years of unchecked authority. To her, the matter was settled. But it wasn't settled. Not even close. Walter slipped his phone back into his pocket, his face unreadable. Margaret, having spent decades by his side, knew exactly what that meant. He wasn't going to argue. He was going to let things unfold. And Miss Jennings had no idea who she had just dismissed. Walter Sinclair slid his phone back into his pocket with practiced ease. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to argue. He had spent decades building his reputation, and he knew that power wasn't always about who spoke the loudest. It was about who listened when you did speak. Margaret sat in her assigned seat, glancing at her husband. She recognized that look in his eyes. It wasn't anger. It was patience, the kind that came from a lifetime of knowing when to act and when to wait. The first-class cabin bustled with activity as passengers settled in. Ms. Jennings, the flight attendant who had so callously dismissed them, moved about the cabin with an air of authority, tending to passengers she deemed important while ignoring others. At the front of the plane, another flight attendant, Daniel, was offering drinks with a polite smile. Unlike Miss Jennings, his demeanor was warm, his professionalism effortless. When he reached Walter, he hesitated slightly. "I noticed you and your wife aren't sitting together," Daniel said, lowering his voice just enough to avoid drawing unnecessary attention. Walter gave a small nod. "We asked to be seated together, but apparently that wasn't possible." Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line. He had worked on enough flights to recognize when a mistake was made and when a mistake was being deliberately ignored. "I'll see if there's anything I can do," Daniel said, keeping his voice even. Before Walter could respond, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Daniel, we don't have time for that," Ms. Jennings called from the front of the cabin, her tone laced with thinly veiled authority. "Let's keep things moving." Daniel's jaw tensed, but he gave a professional nod before moving on. Margaret sighed, adjusting the blanket in her lap. She knew this wasn't over. A few rows ahead, a well-dressed businessman, sipping on a glass of champagne, leaned toward his seatmate. "I don't get why they're making such a fuss," he murmured. "Just sit where you're told." His companion, a woman in a designer dress, shrugged. "They're just some old couple," she said dismissively. Margaret heard them. Walter did too. But they didn't react, because they knew something no one else did. A storm was already brewing. A shift in the air, minutes passed, and the hum of conversation filled the cabin once more. Ms. Jennings continued her rounds, oblivious to the ripple effect she had set in motion. And then it happened. The intercom crackled to life. "Ms. Jennings, please report to the cockpit immediately." The shift in the atmosphere was instantaneous. Passengers looked up. Conversation stalled. Even Daniel, who had been handing a drink to a passenger, paused. Margaret folded her hands in her lap, her expression serene. Walter remained composed, his gaze steady. Ms. Jennings stiffened. This wasn't normal. Flight attendants weren't summoned to the cockpit before takeoff unless it was something serious. Slowly, she straightened her uniform, glanced around, and walked toward the front of the plane. She had no idea what was waiting for her on the other side of that door. And by the time she found out, it would already be too late. Jennings adjusted the cuffs of her uniform as she approached the cockpit door, her mind racing. Why was she being called up front? Flight attendants weren't summoned to the cockpit without reason, especially not before takeoff. Passengers in the first-class cabin whispered among themselves, some exchanging curious glances. Even Daniel, the junior flight attendant, paused mid-step, watching her with a knowing expression. He had seen enough incidents like this to know when something was off. Jennings straightened her posture and knocked on the door before stepping inside. The moment she entered, she realized something was wrong. Very wrong. The weight of authority. Inside the cockpit, Captain Richard Hayes sat in his chair, his expression unreadable. The co-pilot, Amanda Rhodes, was reviewing flight data, but even she seemed unusually focused. However, it wasn't the pilots that made Jennings' stomach twist. It was the screen on the side panel, displaying a live video feed. A distinguished-looking man in a navy blue suit sat at a polished desk, his sharp eyes locked onto Jennings through the screen. The nameplate in front of him read, William Sinclair, Chairman, Sinclair Aviation. Her throat went dry. The Walter Sinclair she had dismissed in first class. He wasn't just another elderly passenger. He was the owner of the airline. "Miss Jennings," William's voice was calm but firm, the kind that didn't need to be raised to command attention. "Can you explain why my parents were denied their assigned seats?" Jennings felt the air in the cockpit grow heavier. This wasn't just a passenger complaint. This was an interrogation. A question without a good answer. Jennings swallowed hard. "Sir, she started, but William raised a hand, silencing her instantly. "I've already reviewed the flight manifest," he said smoothly. Their seats were booked together. There was no reason for them to be separated. She opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. She had assumed. She had dismissed. And now, she was about to pay for it. Captain Hayes exchanged a glance with the co-pilot before clearing his throat. "Mr. Sinclair, would you like us to correct the seating arrangement before takeoff?" William's gaze didn't shift from Jennings. Immediately, Jennings felt a wave of humiliation creep up her spine. She had no choice but to comply. The walk of shame. As she stepped out of the cockpit, her legs felt unsteady. The moment she dreaded had arrived. She walked back into the first-class cabin, and instantly she felt their eyes on her. Passengers who had ignored the situation earlier were now watching intently. Some smirked, others whispered. Margaret Sinclair sat quietly, her expression unreadable. Walter didn't even bother looking at Jennings. He simply adjusted his watch, as if completely uninterested in her presence. Jennings cleared her throat. "Mr. and Mrs. Sinclair," she said, her voice strained. "There has been an adjustment. You will be seated together as originally planned." Margaret smiled politely. "Oh, how thoughtful," she said, her voice dripping with subtle irony. Walter finally met her gaze. "I assume this was an oversight." Jennings hesitated. She could lie. She could make excuses. But none of them would matter. Instead, she did the only thing she could do. She nodded. "Yes, sir." Walter gave a slow, knowing nod. "Good." As Jennings stepped aside to allow Margaret to move to her rightful seat, the whispers in the cabin grew louder. The damage had been done, and Jennings had no idea how much worse it was going to get. Jennings walked stiffly down the aisle, her polished heels clicking against the carpeted floor of the first-class cabin. The once private humiliation inside the cockpit was now about to become painfully public. Passengers had already sensed something was off. Their eyes followed her, the hushed whispers growing louder as she made her way back toward Walter and Margaret Sinclair, the very couple she had dismissed only minutes earlier. Jennings took a steadying breath, forcing her usual, composed expression back into place. But deep down, she knew this moment would define her career. A cabin full of witnesses. Margaret Sinclair adjusted the sleeve of her elegant cream-colored sweater as she looked up at Jennings. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes that made Jennings' stomach twist. Walter, sitting beside her, remained focused on the gold watch on his wrist as if she wasn't even worth his attention. Jennings cleared her throat. "Mr. and Mrs. Sinclair," she began, her voice unusually tight, "I'd like to personally apologize for the inconvenience earlier. Your seats should never have been separated, and I will ensure it does not happen again." For a moment, silence settled over the cabin. The weight of it was suffocating. Then Margaret smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of smile a teacher gives when they know the student has learned a painful lesson. "Well," Margaret said lightly, "I do appreciate you correcting the mistake." Jennings exhaled, relieved that the worst was over. But then, Walter finally looked up. The moment she dreaded, Walter Sinclair, a man who had built an empire in aviation, finally lifted his gaze to meet Jennings. His eyes, sharp and calculating, studied her like an equation he had already solved. "Tell me something, Miss Jennings," Walter said, his voice calm but deliberate. "When my wife asked for assistance earlier, why did you dismiss her so quickly?" Jennings felt her throat tighten. Passengers around them had gone completely silent, their curiosity turning into outright fascination. I was following protocol," Jennings managed, struggling to keep her composure. "I assumed first class was full." Walter raised an eyebrow. "You assumed?" He let the words settle. Jennings swallowed. The way he said it made her realize something. There was no good answer. Margaret gently set her tea down. It's funny, she mused, how quickly assumptions can be made. We booked these seats together months ago. We paid for them in full. And yet, when we asked for help, we were treated as though we didn't belong here. Jennings's face burned. She could feel the stares drilling into her from all directions. Walter leaned forward slightly, his fingers tapping against the armrest. Tell me, Miss Jennings, he continued, if we weren't who we are, would we still be sitting apart? Jennings' lips parted, but she had no answer. The power shift Daniel, the junior flight attendant, stood a few rows away, watching the exchange unfold. He didn't smirk. He didn't intervene. But his expression said everything. He had seen this coming. Passengers who had ignored the situation earlier now watched with thinly veiled amusement. Some exchanged knowing glances. A businessman in the second row tilted his head slightly, murmuring to the person beside him. She had no idea who she was dealing with. Jennings felt her palms grow clammy. She had spent years in this job, years commanding respect from first-class passengers. But now the respect was gone, replaced by something else entirely. Judgment. Margaret folded her hands neatly in her lap. Well, no need to dwell on the past, she said, her voice laced with quiet authority. Let's just hope it's a lesson learned. Jennings nodded stiffly. Yes, ma'am. Walter let out a slow breath, leaning back in his seat. Good. Then we're done here. Jennings gave a tight-lipped nod and turned quickly, walking toward the galley. But as she passed the other passengers, she could feel it. She wasn't just a flight attendant anymore. She was the story they would tell, and the flight wasn't even halfway over. Jennings had barely reached the galley when the intercom crackled to life once again. Miss Jennings, please report to the cockpit immediately. The cabin fell into a hushed silence. Passengers exchanged glances, some shifting in their seats to watch her reaction. Daniel, standing near the beverage cart, whistled low under his breath. Jennings stiffened. She already knew. This wasn't just a routine call. With her head held high but her stomach in knots, she turned and made her way toward the front of the aircraft. As she walked, she could feel eyes tracking her every step. She wasn't in control anymore. The power had shifted and she was now on the receiving end of scrutiny. She knocked lightly before stepping into the cockpit, her breath tight in her chest. Inside, Captain Reed sat with his hands folded in front of him, his face unreadable. The co-pilot, James Carter, avoided eye contact, instead focusing on the instrument panel. But what made Jennings' stomach drop was the small screen mounted on the panel. A live video call was in progress, and on the other end of that call sat none other than Nathan Sinclair, CEO of Sinclair Aviation and son of Walter and Margaret Sinclair. Jennings' mouth went dry. Face to face with power. Nathan Sinclair's presence on the screen was commanding. Dressed in a navy blue suit, his sharp eyes locked onto Jennings the moment she stepped into view. He wasn't just a businessman, he was a man used to making decisions that shaped industries. Jennings swallowed hard, forcing herself to speak. Mr. Sinclair, Nathan held up a hand, silencing her immediately. Miss Jennings, he said, his voice calm but undeniably authoritative. Let's not waste time. I want to understand something. She stiffened, nodding. Yes, sir. He leaned forward slightly. On what grounds did you refuse my parents' request to be seated together? Jennings felt the weight of the question pressing against her chest. I was following protocol, she said, her voice thinner than before. I assumed first class was full. Nathan's gaze didn't waver. Assumed, he repeated slowly, letting the words sink in. So you didn't verify. You didn't check the manifest before making a decision? Jennings hesitated. No, sir, I didn't. Captain Reed exhaled softly, shifting slightly in his seat. But he remained silent. Nathan's expression didn't change, but the weight of his silence was suffocating. Miss Jennings, tell me, how long have you worked for this airline? She straightened her posture. 15 years, sir. Nathan nodded. 15 years. And in all that time, did you ever stop to think that the people you dismiss might be more than they seem? Jennings' pulse pounded in her ears. Nathan exhaled, his fingers tapping lightly against his desk. I take my parents' comfort very seriously, Miss Jennings. But this isn't just about them. It's about the way you treated them before you knew who they were. Jennings felt her throat tighten. Nathan's tone sharpened. Your job is to provide a high level of service to all passengers, not just the ones you deem worthy of it. The words hit like a hammer. Jennings' fingers clenched at her sides. Nathan leaned back, considering her. Now, given this incident, I have to question how many others have had similar experiences with you. How many passengers have walked off a plane feeling belittled because you decided they weren't important? Jennings didn't have an answer. The final decision. Nathan let the silence hang before finally speaking again. Here's what's going to happen, he said, his voice even but firm. Effective immediately, you are suspended from duty. You will complete the remainder of this flight, but upon landing, you will be escorted by security for a formal review of your employment. Jennings' stomach dropped. Suspended. Captain Reed adjusted his headset, his expression betraying nothing. Understood, sir, he said. Nathan's gaze didn't leave Jennings. I hope this serves as a reminder, Miss Jennings, he said coolly. Respect isn't a privilege. It's the bare minimum. The screen went black. Jennings stood frozen, her heart hammering. She had just gone from senior flight attendant to a suspended employee in under 5 minutes. Captain Reed cleared his throat. You should return to the cabin, he said evenly. Jennings nodded stiffly, turned, and stepped out of the cockpit. As she re-entered first class, the shift was palpable. Passengers no longer avoided her gaze. They watched her, waiting to see the aftermath of what had just unfolded. And Jennings knew her humiliation had only just begun. Jennings stood near the galley, gripping the counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had never felt this kind of scrutiny before. The first-class passengers had stopped pretending to ignore her. Some whispered, some exchanged knowing looks. Others simply watched, waiting for what would happen next. She had commanded this space for years. She had dictated the rules, determined who was worthy of her attention. And now she was the spectacle. But the worst part, this wasn't just about today. This was about every flight, every moment, every passenger she had dismissed over the years. And as she stood there, the weight of her past actions settled on her shoulders like a burden she could no longer shake. She had spent so long believing she was untouchable, but now every decision she had ever made was finally catching up to her. Passengers began to speak. A man in his 60s, seated a few rows away, leaned toward his wife and murmured, I recognize her. His wife glanced up from her book. From where? He gestured slightly toward Jennings without making it obvious. Last year on a flight to Dallas. She treated me the same way. Wouldn't even look at me when I asked for an extra blanket. Told me, we're only serving priority passengers right now. He chuckled dryly. Guess that's not her line anymore. A woman in a designer suit near the window frowned. She was rude to me too. I remember flying out of LAX for a business trip a few months back. I asked if they had any alternative meal options, and she just sighed like I was wasting her time. Told me, if you needed special accommodations, you should have requested them in advance. More murmurs spread through the cabin. More passengers exchanging glances. She once scolded my mother for asking for assistance with her carry-on, another man whispered. I saw her snap at a young mother for requesting extra napkins, a woman added. Passenger after passenger recalled a moment, a slight, a dismissal. A pattern was unfolding, one that stretched far beyond this single flight. Jennings had never thought about how many people she had treated poorly. She had assumed each flight was a fleeting experience, that passengers would forget her the moment they stepped off the plane. But they hadn't. They remembered. And now they were finally speaking about it. A reputation destroyed. Jennings could hear every word, every judgment, every past mistake being brought to light. She clenched her fists, her breath shallow. For years, she had walked through first-class cabins with an air of authority, believing she deserved respect, that she was above the average passenger. Now she was realizing the truth. Respect wasn't something she had been given. It was something she had forced. And without that forced authority, she had nothing. A younger flight attendant, Daniel, had been standing nearby, listening. He finally exhaled and shook his head. "Wow," he muttered. "That's a lot of stories." Jennings snapped her head toward him. "Mind your own business." But Daniel just shrugged. "It kinda is my business now." She turned away sharply, trying to block out the whispers, the judgment, the consequences. But no matter how hard she tried, she knew she would never escape this moment. Because for the first time in her career, people weren't just afraid of her anymore. They saw her for who she truly was, and that, more than anything, was her real punishment. Jennings returned to the first-class cabin, her mind still reeling from the conversation in the cockpit. Suspended, under formal review. Security waiting upon landing. The words echoed in her mind like a death sentence. She had spent years commanding authority over passengers, ensuring that her decisions were final. But now she had lost all control. The very people she had dismissed so easily, Walter and Margaret Sinclair, were the reason she was now a walking cautionary tale. As she walked back through the aisle, passengers watched her with barely disguised curiosity. Some whispered, some smirked. The same people who had once respected her presence now saw her as entertainment. But the worst part? Walter Sinclair hadn't spoken to her directly yet, and when he finally did, it would be the moment she feared the most. A man of few words but powerful actions. Walter Sinclair sat comfortably in his seat, his hands resting on the armrests as he gazed out the window. He wasn't angry, he wasn't vengeful, he was simply waiting. Jennings knew she had no choice but to approach. She forced her steps to remain steady, ignoring the way her stomach twisted with every inch she closed between them. She stopped at his row, cleared her throat, and forced out the words she had never once needed to say in all her years of service. "Mr. Sinclair, Mrs. Sinclair, I'd like to apologize." Walter didn't move. He didn't even look at her. Instead, he continued to watch the clouds rolling past the window, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, suffocating. Margaret, sitting beside him, finally glanced up. Her expression was polite but detached, as if Jennings was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "For what, dear?" she asked, her voice soft but laced with something Jennings couldn't quite place. Jennings swallowed hard. "For the way I treated you earlier. I should have checked the manifest. I should have been more respectful. I was wrong." Walter finally moved. He turned his head slightly, his sharp blue eyes meeting hers. The weight of his gaze was heavier than any reprimand. "Tell me something, Miss Jennings." His voice was calm, deliberate. "Would you be apologizing right now if you hadn't found out who we were?" Jennings' throat tightened. She wanted to say yes, to insist that she would have corrected her mistake no matter what. But they both knew the truth. Walter let the silence stretch, watching her squirm under his gaze. Then he leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the armrest. "I've flown on hundreds of flights," he said, his voice steady. "I've met crew members who treat everyone with kindness, no matter their status. And then I've met people like you. People who believe respect is something to be given selectively. Jennings' fingers curled at her sides. Walter continued, his tone never changing. What I find most interesting, Miss Jennings, is that you were so certain of your own importance, so sure that you had the right to decide who was worth your time. He tilted his head. And yet, here you are, standing in front of me, powerless. A few passengers shifted in their seats, listening intently. Walter leaned back, exhaling slowly. So tell me, Miss Jennings, he said, his eyes never leaving hers, now that you've lost everything, what have you learned? A moment of reckoning. Jennings felt her entire body heat with humiliation. For years, she had been the one in control, the one enforcing rules, the one deciding how passengers should be treated. And yet, in a single flight, her entire world had crumbled. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Walter watched her struggle, and after a long pause, he shook his head. You're not ready to answer that yet, he said simply, and that's the real tragedy. Jennings' chest tightened, because he was right. Walter turned back toward the window, dismissing her without another word. Margaret, still watching, finally sighed and spoke. I do hope, Miss Jennings, that this serves as a lesson, she said gently, not just for today, but for the rest of your life. Jennings swallowed, nodded stiffly, and turned away, because she knew this moment would haunt her forever. Jennings sat stiffly in the galley, gripping a disposable coffee cup she had no intention of drinking. Her hands were still, but her mind was racing. The sounds of the first-class cabin, the soft murmur of conversation, the clinking of glasses, the occasional rustle of a newspaper, felt distant, as if she were hearing them from underwater. She had spent years controlling this space, dictating the tone of every flight, and yet, in a matter of hours, she had lost everything. Her grip tightened around the cup. How had it come to this? A career built on control. For nearly 2 decades, Jennings had ruled first class with precision. She knew which passengers to prioritize, which ones to ignore. The wealthy, the powerful, the ones who dressed the part, they got her best service. And the others, the elderly, the nervous travelers, the ones who didn't exude wealth or status, they were inconveniences. She thought back to all the times she had dismissed passengers without a second thought. The countless faces blurred together, but the pattern remained the same. She had never cared to remember them, but today, they would never forget her. She swallowed hard, forcing down the lump rising in her throat. The cost of arrogance. The whispers in the cabin had faded, but she still felt the weight of every gaze, every lingering glance that silently judged her. She wasn't invisible. She was infamous. Her mind replayed the events of the day like a cruel movie. The way she had dismissed Walter and Margaret, assuming they were just another elderly couple. The cold, clipped tone she had used, as if they weren't worth her time. The moment she realized Walter wasn't just any passenger, but the owner of the airline. The public humiliation, the official report, the realization that her career was slipping through her fingers. She had always thought of herself as respected, but now she understood the truth. She had never been respected. She had been feared. And now, stripped of her authority, she had become something far worse, irrelevant. A hard truth. Jennings exhaled sharply, setting her untouched coffee down on the counter. She had always believed that power came from commanding respect, from making sure passengers knew she was the one in control. But today she had learned a different lesson. Power doesn't come from control. It comes from how you treat people. And she had spent her entire career treating people as if they didn't matter. Her stomach twisted. Would things have been different if she had just been kinder? If she had treated every passenger with the same courtesy she reserved for the wealthy? She didn't have an answer, and maybe that was the worst part. For the first time in years, she wasn't sure who she was anymore. A lesson too late. She heard footsteps approaching and looked up just in time to see Daniel, the younger flight attendant who had witnessed everything, leaning casually against the counter. "You okay?" he asked. Jennings clenched her jaw. "I don't need your sympathy." Daniel chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I wasn't offering it." She turned away, hoping he would leave. But instead, he tilted his head and said something that made her stomach drop. "You know," he mused, "I don't think you ever realized something." She stiffened but didn't respond. Daniel continued, his voice thoughtful. "The best flight attendants? The ones passengers actually respect?" He folded his arms. "They don't need to demand authority. They don't have to force people to respect them." Jennings swallowed hard, already knowing where this was going. "They earn it," Daniel finished. She looked away, unable to meet his gaze, because deep down she knew he was right, and now she would have to live with that truth for the rest of her life. Jennings had never been one to apologize. In her years of working first class, she had built a reputation of authority, cold, efficient, and unquestionable. Passengers followed her rules, not the other way around. But now, as she stood before Walter and Margaret, the weight of the moment crushed her. The first-class cabin was silent. Everyone was watching. Jennings inhaled sharply, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Mr. and Mrs. Harding," she began, her words tasting foreign, "I want to sincerely apologize for my behavior earlier." Margaret raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Walter simply waited, his expression unreadable. Jennings swallowed hard. This was worse than any reprimand, worse than losing control of the flight. She had to face the consequences of her own arrogance. "I misjudged you," she admitted. "I dismissed your request without consideration, and I treated you unfairly. That was unprofessional and wrong." The silence stretched. Passengers exchanged quiet glances. Some smirked, others simply listened, but Jennings could feel the weight of their judgment. Walter leaned back in his seat, watching her carefully. "And why are you apologizing?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. Jennings hesitated. She knew the answer. "Because I didn't just disrespect you," she said softly. "I disrespected my position and myself." Margaret finally spoke, her voice gentle but sharp. "And what have you learned from this?" Jennings met her gaze. "That respect isn't given through authority," she admitted. "It's earned through how you treat people." Walter gave a small nod. Jennings had been humbled, and for the first time in her career, she truly understood why it mattered.